Yo, what up? I'm Josh from Budget Church Live Streaming. In this video, I'm going to show you how we took our live stream from looking like this to looking like this. So many churches are live streaming these days, but to be honest, a lot of them just don't look good. And I can say that because I was one of the people running one of those live streams. So I get it, it's hard. There are so many things to consider, from the cameras to the lenses, to the lighting, to the sound, to the volunteers. There's so much. Where do you even start trying to make it better? Well, I've made a list of 5 things that we changed in our broadcast that I think make the biggest difference. So let's go ahead and look at them. Number 1, and I cannot stress this enough, improve your lighting. It doesn't matter how expensive and nice your cameras or lenses are. If the lighting in your room is bad, your live stream will look bad. There are entire series of videos on YouTube dedicated to lighting your stage well for your live streams. We're not going to cover it all here, but at a high level, there are 2 things to look for. 1, make sure that there's enough light on your subjects that they're bright enough on your live stream. And 2, make sure you're not using crazy colors on people's skin and making them look like aliens. It also might be that your stage lighting is already great, but your camera settings are out of whack. If you don't know how to change the exposure settings of your camera, or really what any of them mean, take a look at this video where I break it down for you. Take a look at this clip from one of our original live streams. Our pastor is definitely bright, but it literally looks like he's reflecting the entire sun out into the room. Whereas in this other clip, you notice his skin looks a lot more natural, and you're just not thinking about the lights as much when you're watching it. Honestly, I think that's one of the best metrics you can go off of. If you're able to watch it and you're not thinking about what the lights look like, they probably look all right. Now here's a different example where it looks like our entire worship team is standing inside some sort of black hole. They're just in this void. You can't see anything behind them because there's no backlighting. Whereas here, you can tell that they're on a stage and there's people behind them and there's real depth because we've adjusted the way that the lighting looks on our stage. All that to say, work on your lighting. Number 2, fix your framing. You want to make sure that whatever your subject is filling the frame in a pleasing way. That's kind of hard to quantify, but there are a few rules we can look at. Just keep in mind that none of these rules are written in stone, and there's definitely cases where you should break the rules. We'll get into that later. First off is the rule of thirds. Imagine that you drew lines on your screen and across your screen, breaking it up into thirds vertically and horizontally. If you're trying to create a more cinematic looking broadcast, position your subject on one of those vertical third lines, usually with more space in front of their face so that you're leading them with the empty space. Kind of like this. If you're going for a more traditional style broadcast, keep them in that center third, looking straight ahead. You mostly want to avoid framing things inside the outer thirds of your frame, because it's going to make the rest of the frame feel very empty. It'll also feel pretty lopsided and honestly just not that nice to look at. Now, there's also this idea of headroom or head space, and that refers to the amount of room between the top of the subject's head and the top of the frame. If you give it too much, they end up feeling tiny, but if you don't give enough, you'll end up cutting off your subject's head, and that doesn't look good for anybody. So this one's gonna vary a bit based on how tight of a shot you're getting, how tall your subject is, how many subjects are in the frame. But as a general rule, try to keep your subject's eye line right around that top third line. That will make sure it's in a pretty decent space no matter what your framing is, but just adjust it to something that feels good. There's a lot more that we could say about framing, but honestly, if you follow these 2 rules, you'll be in a good spot. Let's look at some examples. In this first clip, you can see the vocalist is kind of right down the center of the frame. It looks okay, but now let's look at this other clip where she's on the right third of the frame. You can just tell that having her angled this way on the edge of the frame just is a little bit more enjoyable to look at and just feels better. As far as headroom goes, just look at how different it can make this frame feel. Either if we're giving too little headroom and cutting off the top of the head, or too much headroom and just making things feel awkward. Whereas when we get the right amount of head space, it just feels right. Framing is hard because it's incredibly subjective, but the more you look at good examples of framing, the more you'll see these rules in play. You'll also see when it's safe to break them and kind of tweak things to make sure they feel good. Like I said, none of these are written in stone, and you can kind of play with them just to what feels right. Okay, number 3, and that is vary up your shots. Imagine watching a TV show where the camera angle only changes once every 5 minutes. And when it does change, it just changes between the same 2 shots over and over again. That would be so boring. So why do we do that with our church live streams? We'll set up 2 cameras and never move them. We wonder why people aren't watching or they're clicking off really fast. Now, I get it. Some of you only have 1 camera, and in that case, it's kind of hard to change angles because it can be really distracting to do that. So you're exempt from this step. But if you buy a second camera, come back to this part of the video, because if you've got 2 or more cameras, there is no excuse to be switching just between the same 2 angles over and over again. Now, this can be as complex as having a bunch of cameras running around the room and on the stage to get different shots during worship, or just having 2 different cameras switching up their shots during the sermon. It's really up to you. Changing up the angle introduces an energy and just kind of a flow to your live stream that you really can't get any other way. Early on, we just had a couple of cameras on tripods that basically never moved, and honestly, it was really boring to watch and just felt bad. These days, during worship, we have 4 cameras, 2 on our stage and 2 in the room, and they're constantly moving around and getting different shots. This makes worship feel so energetic and so passionate, which is really the way that we want to convey it, because that's how it feels in the room. During the sermon, we switched down to just 2 cameras, but one of those cameras is constantly changing up its focal length in order to add a little bit of depth and variance into how the sermon feels. Take a look. We captured all of these different shots just on 1 camera during our sermon this past week, and you can tell how it would be more engaging than constantly switching between the same 2 shots. I don't know what this would look like for you in your church, but try to vary things up and see if it makes your live stream feel any better. I bet it will. Okay, number 4, one of the hardest things for a church to get right on their live stream, and that's the audio. And look, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this. We meet in a theater every week and have to use their sound system, and so we've had plenty of our own struggles with live stream audio. But we've made a lot of real strides to improve it week after week because we know how important the audio is to our broadcast. People will watch a live stream that has bad video but good audio. But if there's bad audio, no one's gonna stick around, especially because people are listening on their phones and their laptops, which already don't have great speakers. So introduce a bad mix into the mix, and honestly, you're in for a bad time. Again, this is a whole video all on its own, but just a couple of things to look out for. 1, make sure your live stream's not too quiet. This is all too common, and there's really no excuse for it. Just take a look at the meters and make sure you're hitting in a good place. Next, try to mix your band so that no instrument or vocalist is blaring loud or above the rest. Even if it's not an amazing mix with great compression, EQ, dynamics, you can at least make sure that it sounds okay by not having any one thing be too prominent. And finally, try to do your best to level out the audio throughout your entire stream so that people aren't constantly having to reach for the volume buttons and change things. This is really distracting and honestly not a great experience. Something to keep in mind though is that you don't necessarily want to have the decibels reading the same during worship and during the sermon. Things can feel louder even if they're not, so just keep an eye on that. There are a lot of great resources out there on how to improve your live stream mix. If this is something that you struggle with, I highly recommend you dig into it. And finally, number 5, practice. Now, that might feel like kind of a cop-out and not a real tip, but I promise you it's real. Your live stream is not going to improve if you are not constantly working and practicing to improve it. Things are not going to magically get better if you don't spend the time to learn your tools, adjust things that need adjusting, and learn from your mistakes. And the thing is, this doesn't just apply to you, it also applies to your volunteers. Maybe you need to host a training day or ask your volunteers to show up an hour early on Sunday so that you can run through some scenarios with them. It's going to look a little bit different for everybody, but the old adage, practice makes perfect, doesn't just apply to Little League Baseball, it applies here. I hope those tips help improve your live stream. If you've got any other tips that you found helpful, leave them in a comment below. I'd also love if you hit that like button or subscribe to the channel for future videos. Until next time.